A slap. That's how it started. Not a scandal. Not a headline. Just one sound, sharp, clean, cutting through a quiet restaurant on a cold Chicago Thursday, and a room full of people who suddenly forgot how to breathe. The waiter didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Because everyone in that room knew the name of the woman who threw it. And they knew the name of the man she was engaged to, Cassian Drayke. That name didn't float. Press down. On the room. On the waiter. On every person holding a fork, staring at their plate, deciding in real time that what they just witnessed was not their business. Everyone made that calculation, except one person, in the corner, quiet, invisible, the kind of person a room full of people looks through without deciding to. He had a notebook, and he had been writing in it for 20 minutes before that slap ever landed. He saw everything, the shove that started it, the expression on her face before impact, not impulse, not accident, something settled, something chosen. He had all of it, on paper, and when Cassian Drayke walked through that door and the whole restaurant went still in 2 stages, this man nobody had been watching stood up, walked across the room, and placed the notebook on the table. What happened next didn't just end an engagement. It changed what both of them understood about power, about silence, about what it means to finally be seen by the one person you never expected to be looking. This is that story. Chapter 1, The Invisible Life. The slap landed before anyone could breathe. Not soft, not a warning, the kind that cracked the air open and left a ringing silence in its place. The kind that made a whole restaurant full of people forget how to chew, how to speak, how to pretend they weren't watching. Every fork went still. Every conversation died at the same moment. Glasses of wine sat half-raised, nobody willing to finish the motion. The waiter, a young man named Darius Wells, 23 years old, still in his first month at Copper Ivy, stood with his head turned to the side, one hand pressed flat against the serving tray he hadn't dropped yet, still holding it, like his body hadn't caught up to what just happened. His cheek burned red beneath his brown skin. His eyes were wide and glassy and somewhere between rage and the worst kind of shame, the kind that isn't yours but lands on you anyway. The woman who hit him didn't move back. She stood exactly where she was, chin lifted, one perfectly shaped nail still pointed in his direction like an accusation that didn't need words. Her name was Lyra Calder. Everyone in Chicago knew her name. The socialites knew it. The gossip blogs knew it. The wealthy circles that moved through spaces like Copper Ivy like they owned the air inside them. They all knew exactly who she was. Engaged to Cassian Drayke. The Cassian Drayke. Which meant that slap wasn't just a slap. It was a message. To everyone watching. In the back corner of the restaurant, near the window that fogged slightly in the November cold, a man named Soren Valeo sat with a cup of chamomile tea going lukewarm in front of him and a leather notebook open on the table. His pen had stopped moving 3 seconds before the slap, because his eyes had already caught what was coming. He always caught things before they happened. That was the quiet gift of being invisible. You got to watch the whole stage while everyone else performed on it. Hi viewers. I want to ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever been in a room where something wrong happened, and everyone around you just looked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Because that moment right there, that's exactly where the story begins. Soren Valeo was 31 years old, slight in the way that made people look past him rather than at him, with dark locks pulled back from his face and ink-stained fingers that never quite came fully clean no matter how long he scrubbed. He worked nights at a shipping company called Meridian Freight, buried in their archive department, cross-referencing old manifests and logistics records that most people would describe as the most boring job in the continental United States. He didn't disagree. That was the point. A boring job meant no one talked to him. No one expected him to perform small talk or contribute opinions or explain himself over the sound of an open-plan office. He could sit in the dark of a filing room with a laptop and a lamp and do the work that needed doing, and then go home. He was an omega, and in the city of Chicago, in the world he actually lived in, as opposed to the one people liked to pretend existed. Being an omega meant you carried a particular kind of weight. Not heavy in any way you could see or prove, just present. like a low hum in the background of every interaction. People made assumptions. They made faces when they didn't know they were making faces. They spoke about him in rooms he was sitting in, which told him everything he needed to know about how visible they chose to make him. He didn't fight it. He observed it. Copper Ivy was his one weekly indulgence. He came every Thursday evening, always the same corner table, always the chamomile, always alone. The restaurant was the kind of place that had warm amber lighting and exposed brick and a menu that leaned toward expensive without being obnoxious about it. The servers moved quietly. The music was low enough that you could hear conversation but not quite make out what was being said 2 tables over. Soren liked that. He liked that no one ever came to check on him more than twice in an hour. He liked that Marcus, the waiter who always worked his section, had figured out within the first 2 visits that Soren didn't want to talk. Just nod, gesture to his cup when it was empty, and be left alone to sit with his notebook and the soft sound of other people's lives happening at a comfortable distance. He sketched. That was what the notebook was for. Not words, mostly, though he wrote those too in the margins in the cramped shorthand he'd developed as a teenager. He sketched scenes. Faces. The way a woman at the bar tilted her head when she was lying. The way the busboy by the kitchen door always checked his phone between tables. Not out of boredom, but out of something that looked more like anxiety. Like he was waiting on a message that hadn't come. Small things. True things. The kind of details that disappeared the moment someone decided they weren't important. He had filled 43 notebooks. All of them were the same brand. Plain black cover, unlined pages, spiral bound on the left side because he was left-handed and he'd learned early that the spiral on the right side caught on his palm and slowed him down. He kept the current notebook in the inside pocket of whatever jacket he was wearing. The rest lived in a banker's box under his bed, organized by year, with a master index card tucked inside the front of each one. His co-workers at Meridian Freight, on the rare occasions they noticed him enough to say something, called him the librarian. He didn't correct them. He understood their logic. It was just incomplete. Libraries preserved things passively. Soren didn't preserve things passively. He hunted them. He extracted them from the noise of the world around him and pinned them to paper before the world could revise its own story and pretend they'd never happened. There was a difference. He just didn't explain it to people who hadn't asked. He had been sketching Lyra Calder for 15 minutes before she raised her hand. She'd come in with 3 other women, all draped in the particular confidence that comes with money that's been around long enough to stop showing off. 2 of them were genuinely laughing. One was watching Lyra the way you watch a storm from a window, interested but keeping glass between you and it. Lyra ordered wine before she sat down. She sent it back once. Then she ordered another glass and started talking loud enough that the tables nearby shifted, almost imperceptibly, in their seats. Soren had seen her here before, 3 times over the past 2 months. Each time, the energy around her moved the way it was moving now. Staff straightening up, eyes cutting sideways, that specific kind of alertness that people develop around someone who has the power to ruin their evening and knows it. The waiter, Darius, had drawn her table that night. Soren had watched him from the corner as the young man collected himself at the service station. Squaring his shoulders, neutralizing his expression, building the professional wall that service workers build when they know a table is going to be difficult. He'd watched Lyra say something to her companions that made 2 of them laugh and 1 go quiet. He'd watched her tap the table with 1 finger while Darius recited the evening specials. Not listening, already decided. He'd watched her gesture for a wine refill before the previous glass was finished. And then he'd watched her bump her own elbow into Darius's arm. Deliberately, just enough, with the angle of someone who knows how to make contact look like someone else's fault, and send a thin stream of Merlot across the white tablecloth. Then the pointing. Then the voice rising. Then the slap. The restaurant didn't return to normal. Normal was gone. It had been replaced by something brittle and waiting. The kind of collective held breath that a room full of strangers shares when they've all just witnessed something that shouldn't have happened in front of them. People were looking at their plates, or at each other, or at the floor, all of them doing the math of whether to say something, whether to do something, whether the cost of speaking outweighed the discomfort of silence. Soren's pen was still moving. He'd drawn the elbow. The angle of it. The deliberate lean that no one else seemed to have caught because they were looking at Darius's face instead of Lyra's arm. He'd drawn her expression in the moment right before impact. Not surprise, not impulse. Something settled. Like she'd been waiting for a reason and had decided the wine was close enough. Lyra's voice had dropped now, which was somehow worse than the screaming. She was leaning toward Darius with her head tilted, and she said something. Just to him, low enough that the tables nearby couldn't quite catch it, and the color drained from Darius's face like water out of a glass. Whatever she said, it had weight to it. The kind of weight that people like Lyra Calder carried in their back pocket for exactly these moments. Soren wrote it at the top of a fresh page. She knows something about him, or she's making him think she does. The restaurant manager, a compact man named Gerald who Soren had observed enough times to know he was perpetually 5 seconds from a headache, appeared from the back and started moving toward the table with the careful speed of someone trying to look calm while definitely not feeling calm. 2 of the servers near the kitchen had stopped pretending to work. The woman at the bar who had been sipping a martini since before any of this started had turned fully around on her stool. And then someone at the table closest to Lyra's party whispered, loud enough to carry, soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to. 2 words that shifted the whole room's temperature. Cassian Drayke. The name landed differently than other names. It didn't float, press down. Soren watched the manager's already strained expression go another shade tighter. Watched 2 of Lyra's companions exchange a look. Watched Darius, still standing, still holding that empty tray, close his eyes for exactly 1 second like he was bracing for something he already knew was coming. Do you know who she's engaged to? The voice came from behind Soren, from a couple at a table he hadn't been watching. The woman asking the question sounded less like she was sharing information and more like she was issuing a warning. The man with her didn't answer out loud. He just set his fork down. The sound of it, small, clean, final, said enough. Cassian Drayke. There were men in Chicago that people talked about carefully, the way you talk about weather patterns that can turn on you. Drayke was the kind of man that rooms reorganized themselves around before he even walked in. Finance. Private security. Things people didn't put into sentences at dinner tables. His name appeared in business sections and occasionally in sealed court documents and sometimes in the kind of whispered conversations that stopped the moment a third person got close enough to hear. He was engaged to Lyra Calder, which made him relevant to this moment in a way that seemed to make Darius's immediate future look a great deal shorter than it had 20 minutes ago. The manager reached the table, started speaking in low, careful tones to Lyra. She wasn't looking at him. She was still looking at Darius, who had finally lowered the tray to his side and was staring at the floor with the expression of someone calculating distances. Soren turned back a page in his notebook. The elbow, the angle, the before. Then he turned forward again and kept drawing. He wasn't sure why he'd started documenting her specifically. Maybe it had been the first time, 6 weeks ago, a Tuesday, when he'd watched her send a plate back to the kitchen and then tell her companion, loud enough for the nearest table to hear, that the staff here were getting lazy. Maybe it had been the way her eyes moved when she arrived. Not taking in the room the way curious people did, but cataloging it, confirming that everything and everyone was in the right place below her. He'd drawn her 3 times in this notebook. Different pages, different nights. He had a page full of her now. Not because she was interesting in the way that interesting people were interesting, but because she was the kind of person who left evidence everywhere she went, and nobody was ever paying close enough attention to collect it. The notebook sat open on the table, and Lyra Calder's voice was rising again. Soren's pen didn't stop. There was something he understood about silence that most people didn't. Most people experience silence as an absence. Nothing happening, nothing being said, nobody present. But that wasn't silence. That was just waiting. Real silence was active. It listened, collected. It moved through rooms and gathered up the details that sound covered over. Soren had learned this young, and he had learned it the hard way, in a way that had taken years to stop costing him sleep. He hadn't always worked archives at a freight company. That came later after things that didn't need to be named yet, that lived in the earlier pages of a different notebook. What mattered now was what was on the page in front of him, and what was happening 6 tables away, and the fact that Gerald the manager had just pulled out his phone and was typing something with his thumb while pretending to still be in conversation with Lyra. Calling someone. Not the police. The police would have been simpler. Someone was calling Cassian Drayke. Soren's tea was cold. He didn't notice. He was watching Darius, who had moved 2 steps back from the table and was standing in the narrow space between Lyra's party and the table behind them, and the young man's hands, which had been steady during the whole shift, because Soren had been watching long enough to know, were now very slightly shaking. Not visible unless you were looking. Soren was always looking. He wrote one line across the top of the page. Silence isn't empty. It just gives other people room to show you who they really are. And then, across the restaurant, the front doors opened. The cold came in first. Chicago November carried it the way November always did. That particular November cold that didn't ask permission, that walked in with you. And then the person the cold had followed inside stepped through, and the restaurant did something Soren had never seen a restaurant do before. It went silent in 2 stages. First, the tables near the door rippling inward, the way a stone hits water and the rings move out, except this was moving in, toward the center. Then the tables in the middle. Then, finally, even Lyra stopped speaking. Cassian Drayke stood inside the entrance of Copper Ivy. He wasn't what you expected, or maybe he was exactly what you expected, and the problem was you hadn't been prepared for expectations to be accurate. Tall. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that reorganized the geometry of a room. Dark, close-cut hair, jaw like something structural. A black coat that looked like it cost more than most people's furniture. Unbuttoned, over a dark shirt. No tie. No visible jewelry. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his eyes moved across the restaurant with the measured patience of someone who already knew what they were going to find and was simply confirming it. There was a particular quality to the way powerful people entered rooms, and Soren had observed enough of them to have started cataloging the variations. Some came in loud, the volume-first kind, the ones who needed the room to turn before they felt real. Some came in performing casualness, which was always the most transparent version because genuine casual people didn't perform it, they just were it. Some came in scanning, which was the most honest. The ones whose eyes moved like instruments before their mouth did anything. Cassian came in quiet. Not performing quiet. Actually quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't need the room to acknowledge it because it already knows what it is. He hadn't glanced around to see who was watching. He'd entered, assessed, and moved, all in a single continuous motion that had the quality of something very old and very practiced. Not rehearsed. Practiced. The way you practice a thing until it stops being something you do and becomes something you are. Soren had drawn powerful people before. He had a page somewhere, 3rd notebook from 2 years ago, September section, dedicated entirely to the way alphas moved through crowded spaces. The posture of ownership. The pheromone. Release that was less like communication and more like a territory marker, chemical and automatic. He had written in the margin of that page. They don't know they're doing it. Which is what makes it so complete. He watched Cassian move toward Lyra's table and noted the small ways the room rearranged itself around his path. A busboy stepped sideways without being asked. A couple near the aisle turned their chairs slightly inward, unconsciously creating space. The bartender's eyes tracked him for 3 full seconds before returning to the glass she was polishing. His pheromones hit the air before he'd taken 3 steps. Sharp, cold, and underneath that, underneath the sharpness, something that didn't have a clean word. Iron maybe, or the smell of a city in the first hour after rain, before the rain warms up on the pavement. It moved through Copper Ivy the way a frequency moves through a wire. Soren felt it from his corner table, and he was further away than almost anyone else in the room. He watched 3 people at nearby tables straighten without knowing they were straightening. Watched one of Lyra's companions pick up her wine glass and then put it back down without drinking. Cassian's eyes found Lyra. She moved toward him, and the way she moved was different than the way she'd been moving all evening. The sharp-edged authority replaced by something softer, constructed, a performance of fragility that Soren clocked immediately because he had a page full of what she actually looked like when she wasn't being watched by someone she needed. She reached him and said something, pressing one hand against his arm, and Cassian stood still and listened. His face didn't change. His expression didn't shift toward her. He was listening the way people listen when they are gathering information, not when they are being comforted. His bodyguards, two of them, who had entered half a step behind him and positioned themselves with the easy naturalness of people who'd done this in 1,000 rooms, had already moved to flank the space around Darius. The young waiter saw them coming. His face closed. Soren's pen was still in his hand. He looked down at the notebook, at the sketch, at the angle of the elbow, the deliberate lean, the evidence that had happened in plain sight in front of 20 people who'd all managed, somehow, not to see it. He thought about his father. Not on purpose, those thoughts came the way they always did, without permission and without warning, arriving through back doors in his memory that he kept thinking he'd locked. His father, Soren Valeo, who had spent 22 years working for a logistics company and had been let go in his 54th year because a wealthy client had lied about a contract dispute, and no one in the room had said anything different. Not because they didn't know the truth, because they'd done the math and the truth had cost too much. His father had never been loud about it. That was the thing that stayed with Soren the longest. Not the injustice, which was clear, but the quiet of it. The way his father had packed his desk in a box and carried it to his car and driven home and sat at the kitchen table for an hour before he told anyone what had happened. The way he'd said the company's name 3 more times in conversation over the following weeks with exactly the same voice he'd always used for it. No bitterness that you could hear, no edge. As if he was practicing the neutrality, maintaining it the way you maintain a wound that hasn't healed so you don't have to look at it. No one spoke up then. In the room where it happened, in the hallways where people knew, no one said, "This isn't true and I was there, and I can tell you what actually happened." The truth had sat in that room and been outvoted by silence. Soren had been 23. He had already started filling notebooks by then, though he hadn't yet known exactly what he was building. That was the year the notebooks got serious. The year the margin notes stopped being observations and started being arguments. Claims with evidence, sequences of events, the documentation of small wrongs that the world had collectively agreed didn't exist. Soren looked at Darius. He looked at the notebook. He stood up. Several things happened at once when he did. A couple at a nearby table looked up, surprised. Marcus, his usual waiter, glanced over from the service station with an expression that said, "Please don't." The woman at the bar swiveled slightly, and Lyra, who had been speaking to Cassian in low, rapid sentences with her hand still on his arm, stopped mid-word. Soren walked across the restaurant. Not fast. Not slow. The walk of someone who has made a decision and is following it to where it goes. He moved between tables without looking at the people sitting at them, past a waiter carrying a dessert he had to angle slightly to avoid, and stopped at the edge of Lyra Calder's table. Everyone was looking at him. He opened the notebook to the right page. He knew exactly where it was. He always knew exactly where everything was, and placed it flat in the center of the table. The sketch faced up. Lyra stared at it. One of her companions made a small sound. And Cassian Drayke, who had not moved during any of this, who had not shifted his position or changed his expression since he walked through the door, turned from Lyra and looked down at the notebook on the table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and turned the page. The restaurant held its breath. He turned another page. The woman at the bar had forgotten her drink completely. Gerald, the manager, had stopped typing on his phone. The bodyguards, who had been moving toward Darius, had gone still. Cassian looked at everything Soren had recorded. The elbow, the expression before impact, the timeline of the evening laid out in sketches and margin notes with the particular precision of someone who had been trained to document what other people overlooked. He took it in with a slowness that felt less like reading and more like decision-making. Then he looked up, and his eyes found Soren. And Soren, who had been invisible in one way or another for most of his adult life, was seen. Not glanced at, not catalogued and filed and forgotten. Seen the way Soren himself saw things when he was watching, fully without interruption. Cassian looked at him for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds something moved across his face that Soren could not quite name. Not anger, not surprise, something older than either of those. And then Cassian said, quietly, so quietly that only the people nearest to him could have possibly heard. One word. You. Not like he was identifying a stranger. Like he was confirming something he'd already known. Like somewhere in the architecture of his memory, behind the cold iron of his presence and the weight of his name and the two bodyguards and the fiancée and the restaurant full of people all watching him make a decision. Somewhere behind all of that, there was a door. And Soren Valeo was standing on the other side of it. Chapter 2, The Crack in the Wall. Nobody moved. Not Cassian. Not the bodyguards. Not Gerald, who was standing 6 feet away with his phone still open in his hand and absolutely nowhere useful to look. Not the couple who had started all of this, Lyra, with her hand now fallen away from Cassian's arm and her eyes going between the notebook and Soren's face with a particular sharpness that had nothing soft in it. Not Darius, who was still standing in the same position he'd been in for the last 4 minutes, his hands at his sides, very still in the way that animals go still when they've decided that not moving is the safest available option. Not Soren, who stood on the other side of that word and waited. You! The second it hit the air, it had changed the room again. Not the way a room changes when something loud happens, but the way it changes when something precise happens. When a single word lands in exactly the right place and the people around it feel it without being able to explain why. Lyra had felt it. The shift in her body was small, but Soren caught it. The chin that had been lifted dropped a fraction of an inch. The hand that had let go of Cassian's arm moved to the edge of the table and pressed flat against it, like she needed the surface. Cassian still hadn't looked away from Soren. And Soren, who had been invisible long enough to know the difference between someone looking through you and someone looking at you, didn't look away either. Cassian's hand rested on the edge of the open notebook. Not closing it. Not pushing it back. Just resting there. Like the evidence underneath his palm was still being processed somewhere inside him that hadn't finished yet. Then Lyra found her voice. He came over here and interrupted. Stop. Cassian's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It landed the way certain sounds land in empty rooms. Complete, no echo, filling the available space without effort. He said it without turning to look at her, which might have been the part that shut her down more effectively than the word itself. His eyes were still on Soren. Who are you? He said. Not aggressive. Not cold, even though cold was the word people used for him. Soren had heard it. This was something more direct than cold. This was a question being asked by someone who actually expected an answer. Soren reached into the pocket of his jacket. The same wool jacket he wore every Thursday, slate gray, worn soft at the elbows, and pulled out the small spiral-bound pad he kept there separately from the main notebook. The notebook on the table was for observation. The pad in his pocket was for communication. He uncapped the pen. He wrote 4 words and held it up. I work in archives. Cassian, read it. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it reorganized slightly, a micro-adjustment that Soren would have missed if he'd been less practiced at watching faces. He looked at the pad, then at Soren, then back at the pad. Why were you documenting her? That was the question. Not why did you come over here or what gives you the right, or any of the other versions that question could have taken. He'd gone straight to the observation. Straight to the act that preceded everything else. Soren wrote again. He held it up. I observe things people ignore. That landed differently than the first answer. Cassian was quiet for 3 seconds, which Soren had already started to recognize as a pattern, 3 seconds of silence before a response, which was either natural processing time or discipline, and with someone like Cassian Drayke it was probably both. You're not staff here. Not a question. Confirmation. Soren shook his head once. Then why does any of this concern you? Before Soren could answer, before he could reach for the pad again, someone spoke from behind him. One of Lyra's companions, the one who had been quiet all evening, the one who'd been watching the storm from behind glass. Her voice was lower than Lyra's, less practiced, and it carried the particular shakiness of someone saying something they hadn't fully decided to say until it came out of their mouth. He's not the one who should be answering questions. Dead silence. Lyra turned to look at her. The look was the kind that contained a conversation's worth of history. Do not, it said, do not do this here, do not open this door, I will remember. And the woman absorbed it and went quiet again, but she didn't look away. Her eyes moved to the notebook on the table. Cassian followed her gaze. He turned back a page. Then another. Soren had documented 12 minutes of the evening before the slap. The elbow drawn from 2 angles because he'd shifted in his seat slightly after drawing the first one, to get the perspective correct. The expression Lyra's face in the moment right before impact, in the moment of impact, and in the 2 seconds immediately after when she'd looked at Darius with something that was not shock. The drink that had come before 20 minutes earlier. Lyra holding her glass over the table in a gesture that looked like emphasis but was positioned precisely above Darius's notepad. A near miss documented that Soren had drawn small in the margin. Cassian was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not nothing. The kind that is actually working. When he finally looked up, it wasn't at Soren. It was at Darius. "Come here," he said. The bodyguards stepped back. Not because Cassian gave them a sign. They just read him the way people who have worked closely with someone for long enough learn to read the pre-language of their body. Darius moved forward. His face was closed, his shoulders pulled in slightly, prepared. Cassian looked at him for a moment. "She said something to you." Statement. Before the slap. Something specific. Darius's jaw worked. "You don't have to protect anyone," Cassian said. Still quiet. "I'm asking what she said." The young man's eyes went to Lyra. Briefly, involuntarily, and then came back to Cassian. He swallowed once. And then he said it. Low, directed at Cassian, not at the room. But the room was quiet enough that the nearest tables heard it anyway. "She said she knew my mother. That my mother cleans houses for a living and she could make sure she didn't have work to clean." The restaurant absorbed that. Soren's pen moved across the margin of the pad. He wasn't writing for communication this time. Just writing. The habit of it. The way the act of documentation steadied him when things were happening too fast to fully hold. "And then you reacted," Cassian said. "She shoved me first," Darius said. The first time his voice had held anything other than careful neutrality. It didn't sound like anger exactly. It sounded like a correction. Like someone making sure the sequence of events was recorded accurately. "I know how it looked, but she shoved me first. Deliberate. And then I said one word. Just one. And she hit me." Cassian turned back to the notebook. Soren watched him study the angle of the elbow in the sketch. Study the weight of it. Something was happening in Cassian Drayke's face that Soren didn't have a clean name for yet. He filed it. Stored it in the same way he stored all incomplete observations. Not as a conclusion but as a question mark, held open, waiting for more information. But there was something in Cassian's stillness that was less like the stillness of someone deciding what to do and more like the stillness of someone sitting with something they didn't want to be true. "Is this the first time?" he said. Not to Darius. Not to Soren. Not to anyone specific. Gerald, who was still 6 feet away and had clearly been weighing the costs of continued invisibility against the risks of being visibly present, made a decision. He stepped forward. "Mr. Drayke." His voice was controlled, professional, terrified. There have been previous incidents at other establishments that we were aware of when Ms. Calder made the reservation. Lyra's head snapped toward him. "Gerald." "He asked," Gerald said, and then seemed mildly surprised at himself for saying it. "This is..." Lyra's voice was rising again. "This is ridiculous. She pointed at Darius. "He was careless and aggressive and I felt..." "Stop," Cassian again. Still that one word. Still not looking at her. Lyra stopped. The room had that quality now, the quality of a crowd that has collectively stopped pretending not to listen. Forks were down. Conversations were over. Every table in Copper Ivy was oriented, even at angles, even while looking down, toward the drama playing out at the center. Soren was aware of it from his position at the edge of the scene, the particular charge of a room full of people who have been given permission to stop pretending, who have been offered the spectacle they were already watching and told they don't have to hide that they're watching anymore. He looked at Cassian's face again. The 3 seconds passed. Then Cassian looked directly at Soren. "You," he said. The word again, but different now, less the word of recognition he'd dropped at the end of chapter 1, and more a specific address, a directional thing. Why were you keeping notes on her? A pause. Not hostile. You said you observe things people ignore, but people observe things for reasons. What's yours? Soren held the pad for a moment. He wrote the first sentence. I observe things people ignore. He looked at it. Then he wrote the second sentence. I used to study corruption patterns. He held it up. The shift that moved through the restaurant was barely perceptible, but Soren felt it. A slight tightening of the available air, the way attention sharpens when information changes the shape of a situation. Several people nearby leaned very slightly forward. Gerald's expression went from terrified to something more complicated. One of Lyra's companions, the quiet one, the one who'd spoken, closed her eyes for 1 second, like something had just confirmed itself. Cassian read the pad. His head came up slowly. For who? He said. Not aggressive. Not accusing. Curious in the way that sharp people are curious, directed, specific, already several steps ahead of the question. Soren wrote. He held it up. An investigative ethics group. I'm not active anymore. I saw what she did. I wrote it down. That's what I do. Cassian read it twice. Soren could tell because of the eye movement. The small reset at the beginning of the line that meant he'd gone back to the start. You saw her shove the waiter. Soren nodded once. Before the wine. Another nod. Cassian looked at the notebook again. At the sketch of the elbow, the angle, the deliberate geometry of it. He looked at it the way you look at something that confirms a thing you'd been choosing not to confirm. How long have you been coming here? He said. Still to Soren. Soren held up 5 fingers, then wrote. Months. And you've documented her before. Not a question. He'd already seen the earlier pages. He turned back far enough. He knew. Soren nodded. The quiet in the restaurant had changed its texture again. It was no longer the brittle, held-breath quiet of shock. It was heavier than that. More attentive. The kind of quiet that settles in when something true has entered the room and people are deciding whether they're going to acknowledge it or find a way to leave before they have to. Lyra was standing very still. Her 2 companions, the one who'd spoken and the one who'd been laughing all night and had stopped an eternity ago, were both looking at the table. Not at Lyra. At the table, with the particular careful attention of women who know when a situation is past the point where they can help it and have decided that the best available strategy is to be very, very quiet. Cassian. Lyra's voice was different now. The authority had been replaced by something that was trying to sound like hurt and landed instead as pressure. I need you to understand what it was like. I understand what it looked like, he said. I've got it drawn. Silence. 3 seconds. On paper, he added. Quiet. Final. Soren watched Lyra's face. In his notebook, the main one, still open on the table, he had 3 pages of her expressions from this evening. But he hadn't drawn the one that was on her face right now. He stored it instead. Filed it under the index of things that only happen when someone realizes that the version of a story they've been telling is not the version that's going to survive the room. Her eyes moved to Soren. And for the first time all evening, Lyra Calder looked at him. Not past him. Not through him. At him, with the specific quality of attention that people reserve for threats, for things that have changed the shape of their situation. He held her gaze steadily. He was accustomed to being looked through. Being looked at was easier than people expected it to be, once you'd had enough practice with the alternative. Cassian turned back to Darius. You have a name, he said. Darius. A pause. Darius Wells. Mr. Wells. Cassian's voice shifted slightly, still controlled, but something in it had settled into something more direct. I apologize for what happened to you tonight in this restaurant. That's mine to say. A beat. The rest of this is going to be handled. You won't lose your job. You won't lose anything else. That's also mine to say. Darius stared at him. Something complicated moved across his face. The particular complexity of someone being offered something they have no reason to trust and every reason to want. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Short. Cassian reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a card. Plain, no logo, just numbers, and set it on the table near Gerald. Call that number Monday morning. Someone will reach out to Mr. Wells directly. Gerald took the card with both hands. Cassian turned back to the notebook. He stood there for a moment, looking at the open pages. Then he closed it carefully. Not all the way, he left it at the page with the elbow sketch, the first page of evidence, and turned it so the sketch faced up. Then he slid it back across the table toward Soren. Soren took it. Their hands did not touch. But the distance between them at that moment was different than the distance that had existed between them 30 minutes ago, which was the distance that exists between a person and a stranger. The distance now was different. Soren wasn't sure what to call it. He filed it under questions. Cassian stepped back from the table. "We're leaving," he said, to Lyra, to whoever it concerned. Lyra moved. Not how she'd been moving all evening. Not the walk that had brought her through copper ivy like she owned the space around her. She moved the way people move when they are being guided by the architecture of a situation that has shifted beneath them. She collected her coat from the back of her chair. Her two companions stood, gathered their things. The one who'd spoken, the brave one, the one who'd said he's not the one who should be answering questions, caught Soren's eye as she passed. She didn't say anything, but she nodded. Soren nodded back. Cassian was 2 steps behind Lyra when he stopped. The bodyguard stopped. The remaining attention of the restaurant, which was still substantial, still complete, stopped with him. He turned around. He looked at Soren from across the distance of the restaurant, which was 8 tables and the better part of 20 feet, and for a moment nobody in copper ivy breathed. Then he said, just loud enough, just directed enough that there was no question about who he was talking to. "Thank you." 2 words. Clean. Without performance. And then he walked out. The doors closed behind the party. The restaurant exhaled. And then, slowly, the way a room slowly comes back to itself after something large has passed through it. Forks were picked up and conversations restarted and wine was poured, and the ambient sound of other people's evenings reassembled itself around what remained. Darius Wells stood in the space between tables and let out a breath that he'd been holding for what looked like an hour. Gerald appeared beside him and said something quietly. Darius nodded, then nodded again, and then walked back toward the service station with the slightly unsteady gait of someone who'd survived something and hadn't yet processed surviving it. Marcus appeared at Soren's elbow. He didn't say anything. He just picked up the cold chamomile and replaced it with a fresh one, setting it on the table with the particular care of someone offering what they have. Then he walked back to the service station. Soren sat down. He put the notebook on the table in front of him. He opened to the elbow sketch. He looked at it for a moment. His hands were steady. They were always steady. He had never fully understood why. Other people's hands shook in moments of tension, and he had documented that many times, the involuntary tremor that gave away what faces tried to hide. But his own hands stayed still. Maybe because by the time a moment arrived, he had already been watching it approach for long enough that the impact was distributed across the whole arc of anticipation rather than arriving all at once. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe his hands were just used to holding a pen. He thought about what had just happened with the stripped-down clarity that came after adrenaline, when the facts of a thing become more visible because the noise of it has quieted. Darius Wells had been believed. Not fully vindicated, that would take more than one conversation in a restaurant, but believed by the specific person whose belief carried the most structural weight in this situation. That was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something. He thought about Gerald, who had stepped forward when he didn't have to. That mattered too. Small acts of clarity in rooms full of careful silence. He had filled more pages of more notebooks with the absence of those acts than with their presence. When they showed up, he noticed. He turned to a fresh page and wrote, slowly, in his cramped shorthand. Power hides in small moments. A shove that no one records. A humiliation people laugh off. A word in a waiter's ear that nobody writes down. He paused. Outside the window, a taxi moved through the wet street, headlights pulling a long yellow stripe across the pavement. Then he wrote one more line. Until somebody does. He read it back. Then he drew a small box around it, the way he marked things he wanted to find again easily. Not because he thought he'd forget it, He never forgot anything he wrote down. But because some things deserved to be findable, he looked up at the window. November dark pressed against it from the other side, the kind of dark that Chicago made on cold Thursday nights, specific and particular and not like the dark anywhere else. His tea was warm now. He wrapped his hands around it. Marcus appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision and changed the tea out fresh without being asked, setting it down with the same quiet precision he always used, and Soren looked up long enough to nod. Marcus nodded back. They had an economy between them that had never required words, and tonight it required them even less than usual. Soren was grateful for that. And somewhere on the other side of that window, in a city of 3 million people, Cassian Drayke was in a car going somewhere that wasn't here. Soren's pen was still in his hand. He was already thinking about Monday, because something in the way Cassian had looked at him, that specific quality of being seen, of being understood to exist in a particular way by a particular person, had not finished whatever it was doing. It sat in the air the way the pheromones had, long after the source of them had left the room. Present. Undeniable. Not gone. He had been looked at before. He was not, technically, a person that people forgot existed. He was just a person people set aside. Filed under not relevant to the current situation. Archived in the background of rooms where other, louder things were happening. It was different from being forgotten. In some ways it was more precise. People chose actively to not prioritize him. That was a different thing from not noticing him at all. Cassian had not chosen that. Cassian had looked at him the way Soren looked at evidence. Fully, without shortcuts, giving it the time it required to become comprehensible. And the word that had come out of that process was you. Not a question, not a command. Something between recognition and confirmation. It wasn't done. He could feel it the way you feel a door that's cracked open in a room that's supposed to be empty. The changed temperature, the different quality of air, the small and undeniable evidence that the room is not, in fact, empty. He wrote one more thing before he closed the notebook. He wrote it at the very top of the page, above everything else, in the careful lettering he used when he was writing something that needed to be exactly right. You! He stared at it. He wasn't sure what it meant yet. That was fine. He was comfortable with open questions. He had spent most of his adult life in the company of open questions. Things he was gathering toward a conclusion that hadn't arrived yet. Information that needed time to accumulate into understanding. He didn't force it. You couldn't force that kind of thing. You just had to keep paying attention. Outside, the 1st of November's real cold was beginning. The kind that settled into the city and didn't move out for months. The kind that made the streets quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of the city pulling inward, conserving itself. But inside Copper Ivy the tea was warm. And Soren Valeo, for the first time in a long time, was not entirely sure what came next. Which meant, for the first time in a long time, he was paying full attention to find out. Now, before this goes any further, I have to ask you something. When Cassian walked out of that restaurant and said, "Thank you," just those 2 words, to someone the whole room had been treating like furniture for the past hour, what do you think he recognized? Was it the notebook? The evidence? Or was it something else entirely? Because the look on his face when he said, "You," the first time, that wasn't just about sketches. Drop your theory in the comments. Because Chapter 3 is going to answer that question in a way none of you are ready for. Chapter 3, The Collision. The ring came off without ceremony. No speech. No dramatic pause. Cassian Drayke reached across the space between them. Right there in the middle of Copper Ivy, with 20 people pretending not to watch and failing completely, and lifted Lyra Calder's left hand, and slid the ring from her finger with the same contained quiet he'd used for everything else that night. No anger in his face. No performance. Just done. Lyra didn't move. She stood completely still with her hand still extended slightly, her fingers curled inward where the ring had been, like her hand was confused about what it was supposed to do now. The diamond, which had appeared in enough gossip blog photographs that half of Chicago could have described it from memory, sat in Cassian's palm for exactly 2 seconds. Then he set it on the table. Not handed it back. Not pocketed it. Set it on the tablecloth next to the half-empty bread basket like it was a car key. The restaurant absorbed this information in complete silence. And then Cassian turned around, back to Soren. "Sit down," he said. Not a command. Not quite an invitation either. Something in between, the request of someone who is used to being obeyed but has chosen, at this specific moment, to make it sound like it comes with a choice. He pulled out the chair across from Soren's seat at the edge of the table. Sat down himself. No hesitation. The bodyguards didn't follow. They positioned themselves near the front of the restaurant, which told Soren something, that Cassian had made a specific decision about this conversation, that it was being separated from the infrastructure of his usual life, placed in a different category. People with power didn't usually do that. People with power usually carried their power into every room they entered as a matter of course, the way you carry your wallet, because the absence of it made them feel exposed. That Cassian had chosen, right now, to be at this table without the architecture of his authority surrounding him. That was worth noting. Soren noted it. Filed it under questions that would need more information before they became answers. The bodyguards repositioned. Lyra made a sound. Sharp, short, the sound of someone who has run a calculation and not liked the result. And one of her companions touched her arm. The three of them moved toward the entrance in the kind of coordinated, face-saving exit that people practice without knowing they're practicing it, all their lives, for moments exactly like this one. The ring stayed on the table. Gerald, after a moment that contained approximately 4 separate professional decisions, picked it up quietly and moved it behind the service counter. For safekeeping. Or because having a disengagement ring just sitting next to the breadbasket was a specific kind of chaos that a restaurant manager did not need in his evening. Soren looked at Cassian across the table. Cassian looked back. The notebook was still open between them. "You said you studied corruption patterns," Cassian said. He had not ordered anything, had not called Marcus over, had not done any of the transitional things people did to create buffer between themselves and a difficult conversation. He just went straight to it. "For an investigative ethics group." Soren nodded. "Which one?" Soren picked up the pad. Wrote. Held it up. "Alderman Group. Chicago chapter. I left 4 years ago." Cassian was quiet for 3 seconds. The pattern again. 3 seconds. Processing. "I know the Alderman Group," he said. Not impressed, not suspicious. Just confirming that the reference landed somewhere real in his internal map. "What did you do for them?" Soren wrote. "Documented patterns. Systemic behavior. The small things that stack up before the big things people notice." Cassian read it twice. Then he looked at the open notebook again, at the pages of Lyra, the documented evenings, the sketches and timelines. "How long have you been doing this?" "Not for them. In general." Soren thought about the banker's box under his bed. The 43 notebooks organized by year. The index cards. He wrote one word. "Always." Cassian looked at the word for a moment. "Why?" And that single syllable, no additional framing, no "why do you bother" or "why Lyra specifically" or "why a restaurant?" That was the question that landed differently than all the others. Because it was asking for the actual thing. The reason underneath the method. The origin point of a habit that had become a life. Soren held the pen over the pad. He didn't write immediately. He was aware of the restaurant around them. Of Marcus moving quietly at the service station. Of the couple 2 tables over who had given up pretending to have their own conversation and were now just listening without pretense. Of the particular quality of attention that a room produces when it understands it is witnessing something that is not for public consumption but is happening in public anyway. He was aware also of something harder to name. The specific discomfort of being asked a question whose honest answer required more trust than he typically extended to anyone. He had answered the surface versions of this question before. At the Alderman Group during intake. In casual conversations that probed just far enough to find the edge of his comfort and then, when they found it, moved on. He had stock answers, good ones, true enough that didn't require him to open anything he'd closed. He'd used them reliably for years. Cassian was looking at him without pressure. Not waiting with impatience. Not leaning in with the energy of someone who wanted the answer to perform a function for them. Just looking. The way a room looks when you enter it. Open, neutral, available. Soren wrote slowly. Because when no one expects you to see anything, you see everything. And someone should write it down. He held it up. Cassian, read it. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at the sentence the way you look at something that confirms an understanding you've been carrying alone for long enough that confirmation feels strange. Welcome, but strange, like sunlight in a room that's been dark. I ignored the rumors, Cassian said. The sentence came out flat. Not confessional exactly, there was no performance of regret in it, but honest in the specific way that honest statements are when they cost something to make. About how she treated people. Staff at our events. Staff at restaurants. A pause. Not 3 seconds this time. Longer. I told myself it was social performance. That she was different in private. He looked at the notebook. She wasn't, was she? Soren shook his head once. How many times have you documented her? Soren turned back 3 pages. Pointed to the first date written in the margin. Then he held up 2 fingers, then 3. 5 separate evenings. He had been sitting in this restaurant, in this corner, documenting what happened at other tables, for 5 separate evenings before this one. None of those evenings had ended like this, but each of them had been laid down in the record. Cassian looked at the dates. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite anger but contained elements of both, compressed into something that came out looking like stillness. Soren recognized it. He had drawn that expression on other people before, the look of someone doing the math of their own choices and arriving at a number they didn't expect. The worst lies powerful people tell themselves, Soren wrote, and pushed the pad across, aren't spoken out loud. Cassian, read it. They're the ones they choose not to investigate, he finished. He hadn't read it before. He had arrived at the same sentence from the other direction. Soren stared at him. Cassian met his eyes. And there was something in that, in arriving at the same conclusion from opposite sides of a table, from opposite positions in the world, that changed the temperature of the conversation in a way that neither of them acknowledged out loud and both of them felt. Darius came back into the dining room from the kitchen. He had been back there, Soren assumed, being checked on by coworkers, being given water, being allowed the specific privacy that crisis demands before it becomes a story you can tell. He moved with more steadiness now than he'd had 20 minutes ago, though the evening was still visible in his face in the way that real things always are, even after the acute moment passes. He stopped at the table. He looked at Cassian, then at Soren, back to Cassian. There was a decision happening in his face, the visible math of a young man calculating whether to say the thing he was clearly thinking or to let it sit, unspoken, the way things got left unspoken in rooms with people like Cassian Drayke. He was 23 years old and he had been slapped in public and his hands had finally stopped shaking and the man who was engaged to the woman who slapped him was sitting at a corner table drinking nothing, and Darius Wells had clearly decided that if there was ever a moment to say the thing, this was probably it. I need to ask you something, he said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who has decided that the cost of asking is lower than the cost of not asking. Ask, Cassian said. Why do you believe him? He glanced at Soren. You don't know him. You walked in here and you saw drawings in a notebook and you ended a 3-year engagement. A pause. Why? The restaurant was absolutely still. The couple 2 tables over had completely given up on the pretense of their own evening and were just sitting there, open about it now, the way the room had passed some invisible threshold beyond which the pretending cost more than the honesty. Gerald had reappeared at the edge of the dining room and was standing very quietly near the service station, doing his best impression of a man who wasn't listening to anything. Cassian looked at Darius for a long moment. Because the drawings were accurate, he said. And because I already knew she was lying before I saw them. Silence. That landed. You could feel it land. In the couple at the nearby table, in Gerald's quietly held breath, in the particular shift of Darius's posture that said, that is not the answer I expected. Then why didn't you? Because it's easier, Cassian said, to not look at a thing than to look at it and have to decide what to do. Another pause. Shorter this time. That's also mine to admit. Darius was quiet. He looked at the table. Then he looked up, and whatever he'd been carrying in his face since the slap, the compressed, carefully managed weight of a man holding himself together in front of a room full of witnesses. Shifted slightly. Not released. Shifted. Like a door that has been opened a crack. Okay, Darius said. That was all. One word. But it was the word that meant, I hear you. Not, I forgive you. Not, we're fine. Just, I hear you and I'm going to let that count for now. And that was a kind of grace that Soren hadn't expected to see tonight. He wrote it in the margin of the pad. Just a small note. Just a record. Grace shows up in the strangest places. He walked back toward the kitchen. Cassian watched him go. Then he turned back to Soren, and he asked the question that Soren had been waiting for since the moment the man sat down across from him, though he hadn't known he was waiting for it until it arrived. What do you do? He said. When no one asks you to? Soren wrote. I sit in the corner. I drink tea. I watch. And then I write it down. For who? Soren held the pen over the pad for a moment. Then he wrote, for whoever needs it to have existed. Cassian read the sentence. He didn't look away from it for a long time. Long enough that Marcus, moving past the table with a water pitcher, caught Soren's eye with an expression that said something he would have needed words to explain. So he left it as an expression and kept moving. I want to show you something, Cassian said finally. Not tonight. He pulled the playing card from his inside jacket pocket. Not the one he'd given Gerald, a different one, this one with a handwritten number on the back, and set it on the table in front of Soren. Monday, call before noon. There's something I've been carrying around that I think, he stopped, started differently. There's something I can't look at alone. Soren picked up the card. He looked at the number, then at Cassian. He wrote, why me? And Cassian Drayke, who had an answer to almost every question, who had built an empire on the specific skill of always having an answer, sat across from Soren Valeo in the corner of Copper Ivy on a cold November Thursday, and said nothing for the full 3 seconds. Then he said, and this was the part Soren turned over in his mind the most later in the days between Thursday and Monday, he said, because you already know what to look for. He stood, straightened his coat, looked once more at the notebook on the table, then at Soren. There was something in his face in that moment that Soren couldn't fully draw yet. Not because he wasn't skilled enough, but because it was made of too many things at once. Recognition, exhaustion, something that might have been relief or might have been the early shape of it, not quite arrived. The face of a man who has been looking for a thing for a long time and has just located it somewhere he wasn't expecting to find it. In a corner table at a restaurant. In a notebook full of other people's truths. In someone no one had been looking at. I'll be there Monday, he said. And he left. Not with drama. Not with the restaurant parting around him the way it had when he'd entered. He just walked to the door and went through it and was gone, and the restaurant sat with what remained, which was the question of the card, the weight of the notebook, and one word, written in Soren's cramped hand at the top of an otherwise blank page. Why me? He stared at it for a long time. The tea went cold again and he didn't notice. Monday was 3 days away. Felt like no distance at all. And it felt like the longest distance he had ever been asked to cross. He circled the question with his pen. Not to contain it, just to mark it, just to say, this is the thing that matters right now. This is the open door. This is where everything is about to change, if he's willing to walk through it. He sat with it. The restaurant had gone back to its regular rhythm. Plates being cleared, conversations rebuilding. The low, specific music of a Thursday evening reconstructing itself around the strange architecture of what had just happened there. Gerald had disappeared back into the administrative corners of his job. Marcus was setting tables near the window. The couple who had given up pretending to have their own conversation had finally returned to it, voices low, and Soren suspected they were talking about what they'd witnessed the way people talk about things they've seen that didn't happen to them, with the particular mixture of moral engagement and relief that comes from being close to a thing without being inside it. He turned to a fresh page. He wrote, a man who built an empire just admitted he was afraid to look at his own file. That isn't weakness. That's the first honest thing I've seen from someone with that much power in a very long time. He underlined the last sentence, then drew the small box around it, the mark that meant findable. The mark that meant, this matters. He thought about Monday. He didn't know what was in the folder Cassian was talking about. He didn't know what the shape of it would be, or how long it would take to understand, or what would happen after that. He was comfortable with not knowing. He had been living at the edge of not knowing for most of his adult life, and it had never, yet, turned out to be as dangerous as staying quiet. He looked at the card in his hand. He thought, someone is asking me to look at something no one has been willing to look at. And I am exactly the person who knows how to do that. And maybe that is not a coincidence. He slid the card into the inside pocket of the notebook, right next to where he kept the pen. He looked out the window at November, and he thought, someone who has spent their whole life watching things happen to other people is about to have something happen to him. The question is what he does with it. He closed the notebook. He picked up the pen. And for once, he left it uncapped on the table beside his cold tea. Not writing anything. Not documenting anything. Just letting the evening be what it was, without needing to record it first. That was new. It didn't feel bad. Chapter 4, Being Seen. Monday came without asking for permission. Soren had thought, in the 3 days between Thursday and Monday, that he would feel steadier by the time it arrived. That the distance would give him something, clarity, or at least the comfortable numbness that usually settled in when he'd had time to document and organize and file a thing away behind the work of understanding it. That was his process. That was how he moved through the world. Observe. Record. Wait for the pattern to emerge. But Monday arrived and he was not steadier. He called the number at 11:47 in the morning. Not because he'd planned to call that specific minute. He'd been standing next to his kitchen counter with the card in one hand and his phone in the other for 23 minutes, which he knew because the clock on the microwave didn't lie. He called because staying still was beginning to cost more than moving. A woman answered. Professional. Efficient. She had his name before he could write it down for her, which meant Cassian had told someone to expect him, which meant Cassian had been certain enough about Monday to tell someone, which was its own kind of answer to a question Soren hadn't fully formed yet. He was given an address. Not Cassian's main office building, which Soren had looked up on Saturday, partly out of research instinct and partly because looking things up was easier than sitting with uncertainty. The address was a smaller building. The kind of address that doesn't show up in profiles or press releases. The kind of space that is kept separate on purpose from the things that need to be visible. He wrote it in the notebook and took the train. The building was in the West Loop. Brick, older than the surrounding development, with a lobby that had been renovated recently but not in a way that tried to compete with the newer glass towers. A woman behind a desk nodded when he came in and pointed to the elevator without asking his name. 3rd floor. The elevator opened onto a hallway with 2 doors and a window at the end that looked out over a slice of the city. Rooftops, water tower, the particular mid-November sky that was the color of a word you can't quite find. Cassian was already there. Standing at the window with his coat off, his sleeves rolled back, holding a coffee cup that looked like it had been full recently and wasn't anymore. He turned when Soren came in. You came, he said. Soren raised an eyebrow. He had called at 11:47 and gotten on a train and ridden 20 minutes and walked 3 blocks in November cold. The observable evidence of coming was fairly complete. Something crossed Cassian's face that might, in different lighting or on a different face, have been a smile. It didn't complete itself, but it was there, the beginning of one. There's tea, he said, gesturing toward a small table near the window. I didn't know what kind. There were 3 kinds. Chamomile was one of them. Soren sat down and made himself a cup and waited. He was good at waiting. He had spent most of his life at the skill of it. He looked around the room while the tea steeped. A workspace, functional, with a large table and chairs and 2 whiteboards on the far wall, both of them covered in handwriting that had been partially erased and rewritten multiple times, the kind of layered thinking that happened in a room where someone came to work through things they couldn't work through anywhere else. Personal. Not a conference room. A thinking room. He noted the detail. Filed it. Cassian sat across from him, set the empty coffee cup down, and opened a folder that had been sitting on the table closed. Like it had been waiting too. Like it had been waiting longer than today. 3 years, Cassian said. I've been looking at this for 3 years. He pushed the folder across the table. Off and on. Mostly off. Soren opened it. The first page was a table. Not financial, behavioral. A log of incidents across 14 properties in Cassian's business group. Events with staff. Complaints that had been filed, then quietly withdrawn. A pattern so consistent it was almost geometric. One name appeared at the top of every incident chain, though never as the direct subject, always adjacent, always one step removed, the way someone stands near a fire without technically holding the match. Lyra Calder. The records went back further than 3 years. Back before the engagement. Back before Chicago. The incidents had moved with her the way weather moves. City to city, property to property, always landing at whatever table she happened to be sitting at. Soren looked at the dates. Then at the nature of the incidents. Then at the withdrawal pattern, how many of the complaints had been pulled back within 2 weeks of being filed, and what those 2 weeks typically looked like. He turned a page. Another. He was quiet for a long time, which Cassian seemed to understand was not absence but presence. The specific presence of someone reading carefully. Because this was what Soren did. This was the actual work. Underneath the Thursday evenings and the notebooks and the pen that was always in his hand. He took unstructured evidence and found the structure inside it. The pattern that was invisible until someone was patient enough to lay all the data points beside each other and stand back far enough to see the shape. He had done this for the Alderman Group for 4 years across 12 different cases, none of them as well-resourced as this one, none of them with a folder this complete or a primary source sitting across the table willing to participate in his own reckoning. The pattern was clear. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't the result of Lyra being impulsive or difficult in an unpredictable way. It was consistent, methodical almost. She chose settings where she had structural advantage. Where the person across from her could not afford to escalate, could not afford to be right at the cost of being difficult, where the complaint they might file would cost them more than the incident itself. She chose people who had the least to back them up. She was precise about it. And every incident had been surrounded by the same buffer. The name Cassian Drayke invoked before or after, usually not by Lyra herself. By staff, by management, by the ambient awareness of who she was connected to, doing the work for her without her having to say a word. Soren looked up. She used your name, he wrote. Not directly, but it was always present. In every incident. Cassian read it. His jaw tightened. Once, then settled. I know, he said, quiet, flat. I figured that out about 18 months ago. Soren stared at him. And I didn't know what to do with it, Cassian said. Because doing something about it meant admitting I'd let it go on. And I couldn't, he stopped, restarted. I'm not good at admitting things that make me look like I wasn't paying attention. Soren looked at the folder on the table. Then at Cassian. He wrote, Nobody is. That's not a character flaw. That's just being human. Cassian read it. His expression didn't change exactly. But something in it did. Something behind it. The thing that happens when a true sentence finds the space it was supposed to fill. The waiter, he said. Darius. That wasn't the first time she'd done something like that. No, Soren wrote. But it was the first time someone wrote it down. Soren nodded. Cassian sat with that for a moment. That matters, he said, almost to himself. Not a performance. Just acknowledging the fact of it, letting it exist in the room between them without dressing it up. That matters. Soren wrote it in the margin of the pad. Small. Just a note. He kept writing things like that, the small true sentences that arrived in the middle of larger conversations, the ones that had the density of things that had been thought for a long time and were finally being said out loud. He was building a different kind of record now. Not just evidence of what had gone wrong. Evidence of what was being decided, in real time, by two people who had found themselves at the same table for reasons neither of them had planned. Why didn't you act on this? Soren wrote when he got to the end. Because I collected it and then didn't know what I was collecting it for, Cassian said. He said it without the rehearsed smoothness of an excuse. It landed the way confessions land when they're actual confessions and not performances of contrition. I kept adding to the file. every time something came across my desk. But I couldn't look at the whole thing at once. Not alone. Soren looked at the folder, then at Cassian. He wrote, "You needed a witness." Cassian was quiet. Then, yes. That one word, in Cassian Drayke's voice, in a room that wasn't visible from any street-level window, cost something to say. Soren could tell. Not because the man performed the cost, he didn't. But because the kind of stillness that came before it was the kind that means something is being said that has been sitting unsaid for long enough that the act of saying it changes the air. Soren wrote, "What do you want to do with it?" "I want it to matter," Cassian said. "The right way. Not quietly buried. Not a payout that ends it." He stopped. "The people in this file. The ones whose complaints got withdrawn. They withdrew them because they were afraid of what it would cost them not to. That's not the end of a story. That's the middle." Soren nodded slowly. He turned back to the front page, looked at the incident table. Then he opened the notebook. His own, the one from Thursday, the one with the elbow sketch and the 5 documented evenings, and set it beside the folder. Side by side, his record and Cassian's. 2 different perspectives on the same pattern, kept separately by 2 people who had no reason to expect they'd ever sit at the same table. He wrote 4 words. "This is the beginning." Cassian read them, and for the first time since Thursday, since the restaurant, since the ring on the tablecloth and the word "you" hanging in the air above a room full of people pretending not to listen, for the first time since all of that, Cassian Drayke looked like something had settled. Not relief, not happiness exactly. The specific quality of a person who has been carrying a weight alone and has just set it on a table between 2 people instead of holding it by himself in a room with the lights off. "Okay," he said. It was the same word Darius had used. 1 word. Simple. But it meant, "I'm in this. I'm not leaving. Let's see what comes next." They worked through the afternoon. Soren organized. That was what he did. He took the folder's contents and began building a structure out of them, the way he built structures out of everything he observed. Timeline on one side, behavioral pattern on the other, the dates where the 2 intersected, the names of the people who had withdrawn complaints, written in a separate column that he labeled, in his cramped shorthand, to be returned to. Cassian watched him work. At some point he got up and came back with the 2nd cup of coffee and a refill of chamomile without being asked, set them down without interrupting, and sat back down. He didn't fill the silence with noise. He just let the silence do its work. Soren noticed this. He filed it, under things that are rare. 3 weeks later, the first of several policy documents circulated inside Drayke Industries. Soren didn't write it, but the structure of it, the specific categories it addressed, the specific protections it put into language, mapped directly onto the outline they had built together on that Monday afternoon in the West Loop building with the November sky out the window. Worker dignity standards. Clear reporting channels that bypassed the people who had previously been responsible for the withdrawals. An anonymous third-party review process with teeth. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but real. Built from the ground up instead of from the top down, which was the only way that real things got built. Darius Wells did not lose his job. He didn't just keep it either. 2 months after the Thursday at Copper Ivy, he was offered a position on the internal review panel that Cassian had assembled as part of the new process. A seat at the table where decisions got made about exactly the kind of situations he had lived through. He was the youngest person on the panel. He was also, from what Soren heard, the one who asked the most specific questions. That mattered too. Soren wrote it down. There was no announcement, no press release. The documents circulated through internal channels the way that quiet, actual change circulates, not with fanfare, not with a brand attached to them, just as new instructions that replaced old ones. The people in the folder, the ones whose complaints had been withdrawn, started receiving letters. Not demanding anything, just acknowledging, just saying, "We know what happened. It was wrong. Here is what we are doing about it. Here is a number to call if you want to talk." Some of them called. Some of them didn't. Both were acceptable. Both were their choices to make, which was the point of the whole thing. Justice that removes choice in order to deliver itself isn't justice. It's a different kind of control. Soren had learned that at the Alderman Group, and it was the first thing he'd told Cassian when they were building the structure. Cassian had written it on one of the whiteboards, in the erased and rewritten layers of his thinking room, and it was still there the last time Soren had been in that building. Soren documented it. Of course he did. He had a new notebook by then, number 44, same black cover, spiral on the left, and the Monday afternoon in the West Loop occupied 6 pages in the November section, cross-referenced in the index under Drayke, C, and Wells, D, and Calder, L. And one other entry that he had added quietly, on a Thursday evening, sitting at the corner table of copper ivy with chamomile going warm between his hands. The entry read, "Being found." He wasn't sure it was the right word, but it was the closest one he had. And closeness, he had decided, was good enough for now. There would be time to find the exact word later, when more of the story had been written and the full shape of it was easier to see. Cassian came back on the second Thursday. And the third. And the one after that. It wasn't announced. It wasn't scheduled, not officially. It was the kind of thing that happens between two people when a routine forms around them without either of them naming it. The way water finds the low point without deciding to go there, just following what the ground already makes available. Thursday evening. Copper ivy. The corner table. The same tea. Notebooks open on the surface between them, sometimes with new information and sometimes not, because after a while the notebook stopped being the reason and became just the habit, the comfortable ritual that gave their presence together a structure it didn't strictly need anymore but that both of them had come to prefer. Marcus stopped asking if the second chair was needed. He just set 2 cups down now. Every Thursday, without being asked. Cassian came back on the second Thursday of December. Soren was already at the corner table. Same spot, same tea. The notebook was open but he wasn't sketching. He was looking out the window at the street, at the particular quality of December light that Chicago produced when it was trying, in its way, to be beautiful. The city looked different in December. Not just the lights, though those were part of it. Something in the air itself changed. The cold that had been aggressive in November settling into something more resigned, more permanent, as if it had made peace with being cold and was no longer making a point of it. Marcus brought the chamomile before Soren had to gesture for it, and he set the second cup down at the opposite chair with the small nod of a man who has stopped needing to be told what the situation is. Cassian arrived 12 minutes later. Still in his coat. The temperature had dropped further this week. But without the guards visible inside the restaurant. He'd done that from the second Thursday onward. Some negotiation had happened, presumably, between what his security team needed and what he needed, and the outcome was that the guards waited outside and Cassian entered Copper Ivy alone, which created a completely different quality of presence than the first night. Still Cassian. Still the man the room rearranged itself around, slightly. But a different version of that. A version that had something available about it. Something that was not trying to hold the whole room at arm's length. He sat across from Soren. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did Soren. That was fine. They had both stopped needing the silence to be filled. The rain had started outside. The slow, patient December rain that didn't know yet whether it wanted to become snow, and the window beside them caught it in long, thin trails that moved diagonally across the glass. The restaurant was quieter than usual tonight. The weather had kept people in, and what remained was a smaller, slower crowd. The people who came out in rain because the rain didn't stop them, which was its own kind of self-selecting group, mostly couples and a few solo diners, and Gerald moving through his rounds with the unhurried quality of a man whose evening had not yet offered him a crisis. Cassian wrapped his hands around the coffee Marcus had brought without being asked. He looked at the window, then at Soren. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he said. "Watching." Soren thought about this. Not performing thinking, actually thinking, which is different and takes longer and doesn't always arrive at a clean answer. He looked at the window, at the rain moving across it, at the street below, where the headlights of passing cars turned the wet pavement into something briefly luminous before it went dark again. He picked up the pad. "Sometimes. But not tired of what I find. Tired of being the only one finding it." Cassian read it. "You're not," he said. "The only one." Soren looked at him. "I've been looking for a long time," Cassian said. "I just didn't know how to look at the things I was collecting." A pause. 3 seconds. Then he looked directly at Soren, and there was something in the look that was different from the first Thursday, different from the Monday in the West Loop, different from every version of this conversation that had preceded it because it had no architecture around it. No business behind it. No folder on the table. Just Cassian looking at Soren the way Soren looked at evidence, completely, giving it the time it needed. You look at things the right way. Soren wrote. You listened. That's rarer than looking. Cassian was quiet. The 3 seconds. Then, no one's ever told me that before. Soren believed him. He'd observed enough powerful people to know the specific kind of loneliness that came with the kind of power Cassian carried. The kind that surrounded you with people who told you what they thought you wanted to hear, because the cost of anything else was too high for them to risk. When everyone around you is managing you, nobody is actually with you. That was a particular kind of empty that could exist inside a full room, inside a full life, inside an empire built floor by floor over the course of a decade. He knew something about particular kinds of empty. He had filled 44 notebooks with the evidence of other people's lives because his own life had, for a very long time, felt like something that was happening in the background of rooms where other things were happening. Not tragic, not dramatic, just quiet in the wrong way. The way a house can be quiet when it's full of people but none of them are talking to each other. He picked up the pen. He wrote slowly. Power means nothing if you never learn how to listen. He pushed the pad across the table. Cassian read it. He read it once and then he read it again, and Soren watched something in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was moving in that direction. Not the performed expression of someone responding to what they thought they should respond to, but the real, slightly off-balance look of someone arriving at an understanding they hadn't planned to arrive at tonight, in the corner table of copper ivy in December, with rain on the glass and chamomile going warm and Marcus pretending very professionally not to notice anything. He reached across the table. Not for the pad. Not for the notebook. Just toward Soren, and the gesture stopped short of contact. His hand rested on the table, open between them, which was either an ending or a beginning depending on which direction you looked at it from. But it was real. No performance in it. No calculation. Just a hand, open, offered to the available space between them. Soren looked at the hand. Then at Cassian's face. He set the pen down. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. He set it down, which he almost never did while a conversation was still moving, because the pen was the distance, the pen was the management, the way of being present without being exposed. Setting it down was a different kind of choice. He set his own hand on the table, next to Cassian's. Close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance of strangers or of colleagues or of two people who had met in a conflict and survived the other side of it. Close enough that the next move, whatever it was, belonged to both of them. The rain kept falling outside. Slow and patient. The kind of rain that doesn't rush. The kind that settles in and stays a while and makes the city quieter than it was before. And in the quiet you can hear things that the noise usually covers. Inside, Marcus brought fresh tea without being asked and set it down with the particular discretion of a man who understood that some moments didn't need a server in them, and walked back to the service station, and the restaurant went on around them the way restaurants always go on. Other conversations, other evenings, other lives moving through the amber warmth of copper ivy on a rainy Chicago Thursday. Not knowing or caring that something in the corner had shifted, that a particular kind of distance had been closed. And Soren Valeo, who had spent the better part of his adult life invisible, who had sat in the corner and documented the world and never expected the world to look back. Sat at a table with his hand on the table and his pen set down and the window full of rain beside him, in the conversation that wasn't finished. The sound of rain on the window didn't feel lonely. For the first time in a long time, it just felt like rain. And rain eventually becomes something, if you're willing to wait for it. Now, before this story closes completely, I want you to hold on to something. Soren Valeo never raised his voice. He never demanded anything. He never asked anyone to look at him. He just kept writing down the truth, night after night, in a corner where nobody expected anything from him. And the moment came, not because he forced it, because he was ready when it arrived. That matters. Remember that. If the story stayed with you, if you saw something of yourself in the corner table, in the notebook, in the act of bearing witness when no one else was willing, then share it. Put it in someone else's hands. Because the person who needs to hear it might be exactly the person who doesn't know they're looking for it. Drop a comment below and tell me, when was the last time someone truly saw you? Not looked at you, saw you. This community is built on those moments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built for the people who carry quiet things. You won't want to miss what comes next. We'll see you there.